14th century England was difficult, local, and very uncertain. Most people never travelled more than a few miles from where they were born. Disease was common, harvests were failing, and society was certainly hierarchical. A person's place in their life was largely decided at birth. And yet, despite that rigidity, the 14th century was one of the most transformative periods in English history. Within a single century, England faced famine, plague, war, political crises, religious tension, economic change, and social revolt. Kings lost their authority, populations collapsed, and the structure of medieval society began to shift. In order to understand late medieval England, and eventually the Wars of the Roses and the Tudors, we must first understand 14th century England, because this was what changed everything. At the beginning of the 1300s, England was a feudal society. The king at the top, followed by the nobility and the clergy, while the vast majority of the population worked on the land as peasants. Wealth came primarily from agriculture, and land ownership determined status and power. Most villages were economically self-sufficient, and daily life revolved around farming, religious practice, and obligations to local lords. The church was central to life. People attended church regularly, and religious beliefs shaped how people understood the world. Monasteries and priests played huge roles in education, charity, and local authority. For many people, religion provided hope, structure, and explanation in a world that was so very unpredictable. At the start of the century, England's population was also relatively high, around perhaps 4 to 5 million people, which placed increasing pressure on land and food supplies. But suddenly, in 1315, heavy rainfall and poor harvests led to the Great Famine. For several years, crops failed across northern Europe, prices rose, livestock died, and many faced starvation and malnutrition. The famine exposed the vulnerability of medieval society, and most ordinary people lived very close to subsistence level, meaning this short period of failed harvest became quickly catastrophic. And these effects lasted long after the famine ended, weakening the population and damaging the economy. At the same time as this, England was increasingly involved in conflict abroad, especially with France and Scotland. In Scotland, Edward I had attempted to establish English dominance, leading to long-running wars that continued into the 14th century. Figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce became symbols of this Scottish resistance against the English. Meanwhile, tensions with France eventually developed into the 100 Years' War, beginning officially in 1337 under Edward III. The war started mostly because Edward III claimed the French throne through his mother's family line, but economic and territorial disputes also were involved in this, especially over the English lands in France. Early English victories such as Poitiers in 1356 helped to further build Edward III's reputation as a successful military king. These victories also contributed to the growing importance of the longbow, which became one of the defining military developments of the period. But whilst this fighting was going on abroad, an even greater disaster arrived back at home. In 1348, the Black Death reached England, and within only a few years it may have killed between a third and half of the population. The scale of this was devastating. Entire villages disappeared, and labour shortages emerged across the country. All kinds of people had died in huge numbers, and no one fully understood what caused this disease. Many people interpreted it as divine punishment, whilst others blamed outsiders or moral decline, and the psychological impact of this was enormous. But this Black Death also transformed English society economically. With far fewer workers available, surviving labourers suddenly became more valuable. Wages began to rise, and peasants could finally demand better conditions. And for the ruling elite, this was incredibly threatening. The government attempted to control wages through laws such as the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which tried to force workers to accept pre-plague wages. However, this social change had already begun. Serfdom gradually weakened in many areas as these shortages gave peasants more bargaining power. Some people moved for work more freely, and economic mobility slowly increased. At the same time, resentment towards taxation and government authority also increased. The later stages of the 100 Years' War were expensive, and the Crown increasingly relied on taxation to fund these military campaigns, and this contributed directly to one of the most important uprisings of medieval England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. This was triggered partly by the poll tax, but also wider frustrations against the government and the king. Many ordinary people were angry about economic restrictions, corruption, and attempts to maintain the old feudal system after the plague. Led in part by figures such as Wat Tyler, thousands of rebels marched on London. Government buildings were attacked and people were killed, and it almost seemed that the authority of the medieval ruling class appeared very vulnerable. Although the revolt was eventually suppressed and leaders executed, it did reveal the growing tensions within medieval society, and the old feudal system was no longer sufficient. Politically, the century also saw increasing conflict between kings and nobles. Edward II was deposed in 1327 after years of military failure and political weakness. Richard II later faced similar criticism for his style of rule and conflicts with nobles, as well as harsh responses to his opposition. In 1399, Richard II was overthrown by Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. This mattered because it weakened the principle that kings ruled through unquestioned hereditary right. Once the king had been successfully deposed, it became easier for future rivals to challenge royal authority, and that would eventually contribute to the War of the Roses in the 15th century. By the end of the 14th century, England looked incredibly different from the country that had entered it. The population had fallen, the economy had changed, the feudal system was failing, the monarchy was less secure, and ordinary people had begun to gain slightly greater leverage than before. This was an age of transition, and many of the political and social developments that shaped later medieval and early modern England began here. In many ways, the England that emerged after the 14th century was no longer fully medieval in the way it had once been.